How can I be homophobic? I blew his fucking brains out.
Stories about vampires go back centuries and are a permanent staple of entertainment media. You got books, movies, TV shows, and video games. You can find stories about vampires in every piece of media and in every genre. But amongst them all, there's one that reigns supreme: Dracula. Easily the most well known. Stories about Dracula have been told and retold dozens of times, some with wildly different approaches, and he's basically been a horror and pop culture icon for over a century. But aside from him, there's one other creature of the night that's just as well known, whom is literally based off him. Of course, that's Nosferatu. Originally, Nosferatu was based off the Bram Stoker novel Dracula, but because of never getting the rights to actually adapt the book, they had to make some changes to make its own thing. Although, when brought to court by Bram Stoker's widow, the filmmakers lost and they were ordered to destroy all copies. Clearly they weren't successful because here we are talking about it 100 years later. Yeah, so Nosferatu is like the very first unofficial Dracula adaptation. It follows all the same beats, it just changes a lot of the characters' names, but it plays out pretty much the exact same. But since 1922, just like Dracula, Nosferatu received its fair amount of remakes. Matter of fact, the legendary film just had a new remake released by Robert Eggers, which I just saw recently, but we're not talking about that just yet. First, I want to talk about the other vampire movie that came out not long ago. No, not that one. Not that one either. Though I am currently reading the book, so I guess I'm in a vampire mood recently.
And it sold it to a faggot from Wells for $200. The faggot had gone into ecstasy.
This shit is peak fiction. No, the other vampire movie I'm thinking of is the one tied to the other iconic vampire, Dracula, and that's The Last Voyage of the Demeter. Yeah, this was released back in 2023, and it kind of flew in under the radar, and I completely forgot about it. And it looks like most people did too, judging from the box office poll. Now, I do want to talk about the Nosferatu remake, but to make things more interesting, I want to also talk about this other movie based on the other most popular vampire. So consider this sort of a double feature, if you will. Two movies based on media's two most popular vampires in one video. In all honesty, it's just an excuse for me to talk about two vampire movies I've seen recently. But anyway, let's get started with the one everyone forgot about.
Nothing so crazy, I got 108-degree fever.
So let's answer one question. Why talk about The Last Voyage of the Demeter? Why not talk about Renfield that came out the same year as this one? Well, it's for two reasons. Number one, honestly, because everyone's already talked about Renfield, there's nothing more I can really add to it. So I instead want to talk about one that was more overlooked and ignored. And the second reason is because this and Nosferatu are more similar, in the sense of they're more serious versions and not comedies, and they're more so adaptations of the original source material as opposed to just spin-offs. So it just seemed more fitting to talk about these two in the same video. But what is The Last Voyage of the Demeter? Well, in the original Dracula, and even Nosferatu, he takes a ship to get to England, and while on that ship, Dracula, spoilers I guess for a 140-year-old story, Dracula ends up killing the entire crew on his way to England. It's only one chapter in the original book, chapter 7 to be specific, so they're basically taking this one section and just making it its own movie. Interesting approach.
Let's see if it pays off for him.
Well, let's talk about how they did. The director is the same guy behind Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark and Troll Hunter, so not a bad choice. Just like this movie, it was actually a pleasant surprise, I'm being honest. Though, don't go in expecting a gore fest. When the kills happen, they are good, but this movie is more about building tension and suspense. The movie's more about the fear and uncertainty of the crew and them trying to figure it out. I've actually seen it described as Alien, but on a ship, and I can kind of see it, honestly. They're in one location, stranded in the middle of nowhere, and an unsuspecting crew getting picked off by a monster that gradually gets stronger. Though, again, don't go in expecting a bloodbath, and the focus is definitely placed more towards the crew rather than Dracula. It's more about their struggle for survival, with appearances from Dracula becoming more frequent towards the end. So that being said, yeah, it is a slower paced movie, but one that I pretty much mostly enjoyed. Now, since it's based off just one chapter of a book, clearly they had to expand on a lot and add some more stuff. This mainly comes in the form of characters getting more attention that wasn't there in the book, and this isn't a bad thing, it makes sense. And the characters themselves are mostly fine. They're all played by some very good actors. So even though I thought the characters themselves were just okay, the actors did a good job. No phoned in performances at all. Another addition is they added in this chick who's basically Dracula's feeding stock, and she was in one of the crates. And through her is how they learn about what they're up against. Additions like this are fine, and considering they're only working with just one chapter of a book, it completely makes sense on why they did this. These additions were fine and necessary to help flesh out the movie. So the cast is fine, these additions are fine, but the set at times look really fucking good. You get a great sense of claustrophobia while they make their way through the ship. And even though it's all in one location, they use the space pretty well so it doesn't get dull. Usually just by doing a simple trick of just shooting from a different angle and continuously showing you a few different spots. There's really only a few reused spots and locations throughout the whole movie. It's a common issue that movies that take place in one place tend to run out of interesting ways to present it to you. But here, for the most part, they did a pretty solid job. And the ship itself looks really fucking good. Which really shouldn't be surprised when you just take a look at the behind the scenes footage. Look at this stuff. They definitely put a lot of effort into making this thing come to life. And the design of Dracula himself is also pretty decent. As he feeds, he gets stronger and his design changes throughout the movie. At one point, he even looks a little bit like Nosferatu, which is pretty ironic. And this is definitely the monstrous form of Dracula. You don't see him in his human form at all, which I can dig. It's a nice change of pace seeing Dracula hunting. His design overall looks pretty good throughout, at least until the end where it gets more CGI reliant, which is a little bit unfortunate because they clearly used a lot of practical effects, but then it looks like they either like enhanced it or touched it up with CGI afterwards. So it's like kind of a hybrid, where at times it's mostly practical effects, but at other times it's mostly CGI in the frame. Especially towards the end, it's definitely more CGI reliant. But really the biggest problem with this is that the CGI is very noticeable. Now it doesn't completely take me out of the experience, but it is just a little bit disappointing. But for what it is, I do think overall it's pretty good. Honestly, the only issue I really have is the runtime. The movie is too long complaint gets thrown around a lot these days, but this time it is a bit warranted. It's nearly 2 hours long, and it kind of gets to the point towards the end where you kind of want it to wrap up. Seriously, cutting it down by like 10 to 15 minutes would have helped this movie a lot. And this ties into my next complaint, which is the ending. Well, it's just a bit strange. So it appears to be leaving itself open for a sequel, and well, it's just a bit odd. The direction the sequel would have to go in probably wouldn't follow the book that well. Well, spoilers, you see, the main character survives, and while in England, he makes it his mission to kill Dracula. So like, how would that work? Would he just meet up with the main character from Dracula and then help them? Or would now his story be completely different from the rest of the book? If I'm being honest, it just seemed like a bit of a shoehorn in addition or attempt for a sequel. But judging from the box office, it doesn't really seem like it's gonna be getting one anytime soon. Like seriously, if it just ended like 10 minutes before this stuff and wrapped things up a little bit differently, you know, with everyone actually dying and no sequel bait ending, it would have been much better. Yeah, so that was a bit strange and honestly could have done without it. But overall, I gotta say, it's not a bad movie, and I still enjoyed it a lot. It was at its best when it was slowly building the atmosphere and tension. The ending was a bit unnecessary, sure, but it didn't ruin the overall experience for me. It's a good looking movie with its sets, outfits, and the ship that it all takes place on. And when the kills do happen, there's a decent amount of blood and gore, and they're not bad at all. Sure, it sucks they used a bit more CGI on Dracula than I really liked, but it's definitely not the worst design of Dracula I've ever seen. I think as long as you know what you're getting into when you see this, you'll have a better time. Don't go in thinking it's gonna be an over-the-top, bloody gore fest. No, it's definitely slower paced, the more focus on the crew just trying to survive. And Dracula becomes more of a presence and threat as the movie goes on. So overall, not bad.
This Luger will send a Christian to hell.
Now the film of the hour, the Nosferatu remake. Robert Eggers has been making a name for himself recently, with each movie receiving attention and high praise, and I can't deny that it's well deserved. The man makes some pretty damn good movies. From a technical and filmmaking standpoint, his films are pretty damn good. They all are visually impressive, great camera work, and he does a great job at capturing the time period his films take place in, and Nosferatu is no different. Of course, this is a remake of the original film from 1922, over 100 years ago now, so it retells the same story, which I'm sure you all know at this point, because it's literally an unofficial adaptation of Dracula, so it follows mostly the same story beats and events. I mean, do I really need to explain the story of Dracula? You know, the 130-year-old story that's been readapted dozens and dozens of times? Okay, I'm gonna do it anyway. So you got a couple here, Thomas and Ellen. Thomas's boss tells him that he has sold a really old manor in town, and so he has to go and finalize the deal. So Thomas goes ahead and travels across Europe to meet up with this old guy in his creepy castle. He gets there and, surprise, surprise, it's Count Orlok.
I just saw a fucking vampire!
But not only that, Count Orlok is obsessed with Thomas's wife, and he makes a trip to England to go get her. Then what follows is some gothic horror obsession.
You must bounce on it.
Now I will say it does add a few things here or there to switch it up a little bit, but for the most part it's the same story. This time it's done with more style and, well, color and sound. Now where to start? Well, visually this is a movie to behold. It's downright gorgeous at times. It captures that dark, eerie, gothic vibe perfectly. It's a very atmospheric movie, making you just feel the dread. Every shot is just dark and eerie, and every set and location is well detailed. Unsurprisingly, it's a very impressive movie on a technical level, but I expect nothing less from Robert Eggers at this point. But let's get the big thing out of the way first. Bill Skarsgard. Yeah, he's pretty fantastic here. He's so good that I actually forgive him for The Crow. His makeup and prosthetics are done so damn well. Not just on his face, hands, but also his entire body. He's all torn and just scabbed up. It's honestly pretty gross, but like in a good way. And Skarsgård's performance was also just fantastic in general, and I love the way they present him. For the first part of the movie, hell, for most of it actually, you don't really get a good look at him. He's either always out of focus or just out of frame, or he's hidden by the shadows and darkness. But even then, his presence is just felt. His deep, gravelly voice just cuts right through, and so does his deep, raspy breathing. It's uncomfortable as hell sometimes. Another thing I like is Orlok's power over people, the stuff that he makes them do and how he messes with their heads. It leads to some pretty weird sequences that Eggers likes to put into his movies. And it's to the point where you can't really tell if it's a dream or not, but it's pretty much perfect because it just showcases what he can do and how he affects people. And it was just overall just really cool to see. I mean, he was just stressing motherfuckers out in this movie. So I really like the way they showcase his powers here. Yeah, honestly, everything evolving around Orlok is just my favorite parts of the movie. Seeing him and hearing him on screen just really pulled my attention every every single time. I mean, don't get me wrong, all the actors and characters are good, hell, even great. There's not a bad performance in sight, but man, Orlok was just so good in this. Now, speaking of characters, I won't lie, there were a few times where I kind of chuckled. Willem Dafoe's character is the one that kind of made me laugh a bit. It feels like he's playing it up a bit, and almost borders on cheesy, but it's not so over the top that it becomes silly. He's definitely the more eccentric character, but since he's studied the occult and such, I guess that would make sense in this world. He's seen some shit, and maybe he's gone a little mad. Lily Rose Depp is also a standout, with her switching and changing her emotions on a dime in the same scene several times. She can go from calm and collected to completely stressed the fuck out. But, not gonna lie, there were a few times where I kinda laughed.
Is it the thanks that I get for putting you bitches on? Is it my fault that all of you bitches gone?
I'm sorry, this looks funny as hell even with context.
Car in the rear.
Yeah, so everybody was good, solid, even great points. Bill Skarsgard and Willem Dafoe were just my absolute favorites though. Now this is also a very slow-paced movie. It takes a bit to get to Orlok's castle, but once it does, that's when I think it gets more interesting. But even then, it doesn't get any more bigger or action-packed. It's more so about the dread and then taking in all the gothic horror vibes. But don't get me wrong, there's still some blood and gore here and there, sprinkled throughout the whole movie, and some kills, so you definitely get that. And not to mention just several little sequences that are just kind of bizarre and weird that feel very dreamlike, which again, I feel like was the intent, showcasing Orlok's power over people and what he does to their minds. Now the only other thing I want to mention, and it's not really a complaint, but since this is retelling Nosferatu, and by proxy Dracula to an extent, you basically know how it's gonna go. There are a few things added in to mix it up, but for the most part, it's the same story. So it doesn't offer anything that new to the plot. I just wanted to mention it because I've seen some people complain about being pretty boring and predictable because, well, they've already seen the story. Which obviously is what's gonna happen, you know, it's a remake. But when retelling a story as old as this, and that has been readapted so many times, at that point you basically gotta look at how well they told it, and overall how well it's just made. And in this case, it was great. Now, is this Robert Eggers' best movie? No, I personally don't think so. Though it is definitely his biggest. The box office is doing great. So it's good to see that a lot of people are checking this movie out. One thing he kept mentioning in interviews is that he wanted to make vampires scary again. He wanted to take it back to their roots. And in that regard, I think he did it. Orlok is a damn threat here. He's a menace. He fucks with people's heads, manipulates people, and tries to steal your girl. I think it's going to do it for the video. I just want to take a moment to talk about just 2 vampire movies. That was it, honestly. I enjoyed it. Hope you guys did too. Yeah, I only got shit else to say, so see ya.
Shorty looked so good, I used her piss as crab boil.